to the Philly Young Adults Podcast. My name is Josh, and I'm here in the studio today for another. We've had some revolutionary episodes. You know, we don't like to brag here on the podcast, but we've had some new things happening this year. We had our first ever remote podcast recording off-site, and today we're doing our first ever video recording / audio recording, which, you know, people are doing these days. We're kind of a little bit behind the ball, but so we had to bring in a very attractive, beautiful guest to be on video today. So we have with us our good friend, Dr. Dominick Hernández. What's up, Dominick?
It's great to be with you, Josh. Thanks for the beautiful comment. Though weird, encouraging, I guess.
Yeah, so if you don't know Dr. Dominick, he is, and I'm going to read this directly off of your website, so if it's anything is incorrect, then you'll probably have to edit this. Okay. Dr. Dominick is currently the Associate Professor of Old Testament and Semitics at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University. Is that correct, Dominick?
That is all correct.
Yeah, and in addition to teaching other classes in English and Spanish, correct?
That's right.
Yeah. How many in total, like right now, classes are you teaching?
The semester just ended, so I'm teaching absolutely 0 classes at this point.
School's out for the summer.
This past semester, I taught 5 courses, so 3 were on campus in English and 2 were online in Spanish.
Cool. And you're living in California right now.
Live in Los Angeles.
Yep.
Love the weather.
Nice weather life.
Absolutely.
Yep. But you are originally from Philadelphia.
I am. Well, I was born in New York City. When I was young, my family moved to what was called then Lacey Park. Mm-hmm. So it's a housing sector in Bucks County, not far from here. Mm-hmm. And so I grew up in this area, real close to this church, which is in Northeast Philly. Mm-hmm. You know, just down Byberry Road, for those of you that are local, about a 15-minute drive from here into Bucks County. So I lived there for the longest period of my life before then moving around and ending up in a bunch of other places that maybe we could talk about at some point.
Yeah, and we like to kind of claim you as our own here because once upon a time you were an intern of sorts serving at Calvary Chapel, Philadelphia. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, so my connection with Calvary Philly it's a convoluted one, but a really good one in this sense. I had an aunt that became a believer when I was younger, and she started attending a church in Jersey just across the Delaware River. And there was a youth pastor at that church that she wanted to get me hooked up with when I was an early teen. And that youth pastor eventually ended up leaving that church with some of his youth and coming and being the youth pastor at Calvary Philly. And so that's how I got introduced to Calvary Philly when I was an early teenager. So came here sometime during that time occasionally, and then eventually ended up going to college, went close by, went to Westchester initially, and went to some churches there. But then after getting married, after living abroad and coming back and getting married, my wife, who was predominantly a Spanish speaker, wanted to attend someplace where they spoke Spanish. And so after several sort of different places that we lived in and the like, we came back to Calvary Philly when I was in seminary and started attending the Spanish language service here, helping out as much as possible. And
you were just kind of, before we started recording today, saying one of the things you value about being back in Philly is just getting to simply watch a Phillies game or an Eagles game with
people that
fellow
care as
Philly
much as us,
who know and care about such things.
That's
right?
exactly right. With people that care, it's not just knowing and caring; it's about knowing and caring as much as the Philly fans.
Yes,
yeah,
caring
sitting and
way
being
too
able,
much.
being able to talk with people and shout at the television and do the types of things that people that have only spent a long time of their life in this area truly understand.
Mm-hmm. So you have been a friend of our church community for a long time and part of the family here, which we're very thankful for your friendship. Also, if you didn't know and you're listening or watching today, Dominick was one of our speakers at our Young Adults Conference back in 2020, has been on the podcast before. So we're really thankful you're here today. On a personal note, we together, once upon a time, also got to watch an Eagles game in Israel together in your apartment, laying on your floor, watching on the screen. And that was a good memory. That was a good time. It's
a memory, actually, that my son, who was young at the time, maybe 3 or 4 years old, still actually talks about. Mm-hmm. That time that Josh came from, I think you were in Jerusalem, and I went and picked you up, and we drove to my house in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area, and we watched an Eagles game.
And
which is a big deal,
yeah.
Which is a big deal when you're living abroad in the Middle East and no one else gets it. Mm-hmm. You get it. So thanks for coming over. Yeah. And we ate burgers.
Yes, I do remember that too.
Yeah.
One of the things that I just think is always cool is like when you walk with the Lord for any amount of time, it's just fun to see where He takes your path. And I'm sure you are no exception, being able to look back at your life and just like seeing the places the Lord has led you. You probably would have never written that script, but I'm sure you're super thankful for where you are today.
I'm in the process of actually writing down some of these stories of my life, just thinking through where I started, as a human being, but also spiritually, the journey. And you talk about writing the script. The script is so convoluted, again, to use that word, that it's difficult to even trace what's happened. I'm 45 years old. It's difficult to trace what has happened up to this point and make sense out of it. But by God's grace, here we are, and just trying to live well and serve the community of God where He's put me for the time being, because who knows what the next years, if we have them, who knows what those next year, if I have them. That sounds a little bit morose. It's not intended to be, but if we have 45 more years, who knows what they're going to look like. Just trying to be faithful and serve now.
So when you have a college professor and someone as knowledgeable as yourself who's been trained up and learned a lot about the Bible, we thought we'd be here today as our main goal to ask you some tough Bible questions as a way to encourage our listeners, and maybe they've been posed with these types of questions before, and how do I answer that type of question? So we're going to get to that in a minute, and Dominick is ready for that. However, before we do, I do want to ask you to share one thing about yourself. On a personal level, you are a man of many talents, and one of your talents that I am aware of is that you are adept at fake falling. Could you explain to our listeners or viewers today, how did you develop this talent in your life?
Wow, fake falling. I've been doing that much less in my older age, but it occasionally comes out. So when I was in my early 20s, I realized that I could really get a laugh out of my friends if I were to learn how to fall well. People think it's funny when
like
people
in public
fall.
settings.
Like in public settings,
Yeah.
yes. And so it's sort of like a joke that you withhold from the public that's looking at you, but your close friends know. So if you're walking with a group of friends and they know you're the faller, you can make them laugh and by way of making others who don't know that you're a faller concerned about you. It's an immature joke that I love. So so I've learned to fake fall pretty well in public. Probably the best, and one of the last times I did it was there was a stack of hay around Halloween time in a bowling alley. I was in New York. It was a bowling alley. We're in a bowling alley.
In the bowling alley.
In the bowling alley, there was a stack of hay, and I started talking to my friends and walking backwards toward the stack of hay, knowing exactly where it was, and then fell into the stack of hay, fell over the stack of hay, caused a big...
Were people like, oh my gosh, are you okay?
That's exactly what makes it funny for my friends. After that time, I thought, maybe this is getting a little bit out of hand. So I've calmed down a little bit with the fake falling. But now that you mentioned it, I at least probably need to teach this to the next generation.
That's right.
I need to.
Yeah, your children need to know. You got to pass this along.
Absolutely.
But at least if you are kind of retiring from this sort of behavior, at least you went out with a bang, right? At the bowling alley.
Was a big deal.
Yeah.
And that's precisely what got me thinking, maybe that was the best I could do here.
Yeah. So, cool. Just wanted our listeners, if they don't know you, to get to know you a little bit. If you want to know more about Dr. Dominick Hernández and his ministry and things going on in his life, there are ways people can do that, right?
Yeah. The number one way is at my website, domshernandez.com, but I'm also, because of my profession, omnipresent on social media.
Omnipresent.
So Instagram, Facebook, X.
Formerly Twitter.
X, formerly Twitter. I'm on TikTok. If you do TikTok, mostly doing videos, short videos answering questions like this on TikTok. So it's something like Dom Hernandez or Dom S. Hernandez or Dr. Dom Hernandez on all of those.
Or Dr. Dom is thebomb.com.
Which is my fan page that I didn't make. Some of my former students made a fan page called Dr. Dom is thebomb.com on
And it
Facebook.
does still exist, right?
It still exists. And somehow, some way, funny pictures and videos are still being passed around on that fan page.
So don't forget to check that out as well.
Don't forget to check it out if you're interested in making fun of me.
Yeah. So speaking of questions, let's get to some questions today. So the first one, real softball, of course, for someone like yourself, who is, again, trained and been well-educated and is constantly learning. A question that might come up about God or the Bible is something like, well, if God is so loving and he is perfect and he is God, then why does he allow suffering in the world, X, Y, and Z? And I think this is, I know you're going to, answer this no problem, but I think that this is particularly tough in my mind when it's someone who poses the question to you because they've experienced some type of traumatic event, whether it's like their family member had cancer, or it's not just they're trying to stump you, but like they've really experienced something and they're like, why would God allow this thing in my life? So how would you maybe begin to answer that type of question?
I like the way you say begin to answer, because as we talk through these types of Bible questions that we're probably, the types of Bible questions that we're going to talk about today, these questions have been brought up before. The Bible, people have been reading it for thousands of years, literally, and some of the things that confuse us confuse the ancients, and so we continue to talk through these things, not because we necessarily have comprehensive answers to these questions, but rather we might be able to join a broader conversation that's helpful for Christian people. This question is not an easy one. You said it's a softball. Thanks. It's not an easy one.
Yeah.
I think we could start off answering this in a couple of different ways. The first thing is it's a theological question, and it relates to if God created things good, like how did evil get into the world? And I think that a traditional Christian response is that humankind, through Adam and Eve, disobeyed. And as a result of that, the world, which was once perfect as it is depicted in Genesis 1 and 2, though not a comprehensive account, still an account of the world being different than it is now, that state of perfection was tainted. And what we experience now is as a result of living in what Christians frequently call a fallen world, or an imperfect world, to say the least. Now, that theological reason, as true as I think it is, and I didn't flesh out all of the details or all of the implications, but as true as it is, hardly helps people when they're going through it,
right?
Which is precisely what you just said. So the question is, why does God permit this, and frequently ellipsis, in my life, in the life of the church, in the world? And we're seeing wars in the world and lots of people dying and these terrible things happening. And this brings up a theological issue that is much more personal, which is the question of theodicy, which you almost completely stated in the intro to the question. And that is, since we believe God to be all-powerful, all-knowing, but especially all-powerful, then why doesn't he eliminate issues with evil and suffering in our world if he's all-powerful? And that's it. In part, we could even nuance that some more, but that is a more personal question when we're going through issues, or when we're seeing issues on the news, like wars that are affecting innocent people, what we would consider to be innocent people by the world's standards. Like, this person wants nothing to do with this war, and here they are suffering because of this. And I think that question, the answer to that question the short answer to that question is we don't know.
Yeah, we don't always know.
We don't, yeah, right. The longer, more expounded version or answer to that, as I think, we learn unique things about ourselves in light of who God is by witnessing and going through these types of situations. And that is where I think the answer could be helpful. So I've read Job almost every day of my life for the past couple of 15 years, and we frequently think of Job when we think of especially quote-unquote innocent suffering.
Have any questions or comments on your mind about today's episode or anything related to the Philly Young Adults podcast? Send us a text using the link in the show notes, or message us on Instagram at PhillyYoungAdultsCC. You can also send us an email at ya@ccphilly.org. We always appreciate hearing feedback from our listeners. You are the reason this podcast exists after all. Now, let's get back to today's episode.
Now, I'm not so sure that the book is as much about innocent suffering as we make it out to be, but we do learn a couple of things about the character of God and human response in the book of Job. So one of the first things we learn is that when these difficult things happen, an appropriate response is being direct and open and honest with God. We frequently don't recognize the theological truth that we can be open and honest with God about everything in our hearts until we're going through a period in which we have to. Mm-hmm. So we're either open and honest and direct with God, or we suppress it, and the suppressing is never healthy.
Yeah.
That's one thing, right? Mm-hmm. So we learn that about Job. But here's what we learn about fellow people. We've learned that circumstances don't necessarily indicate that there's just retribution going on in any particular situation. So it's not really possible to judge people based upon their circumstances. That is a big deal living in this world. We can't look at people that are going through a war and say, that's national judgment. We can't look through people that are going through cancer and say, that's personal judgment. Mm-hmm. We only learn that as a result of the suffering and the evil that's been permitted to enter into the world. And then also I would say another thing that we learn through this situation is, and maybe the most important theological thing that hits our heart, is this idea of human finitude. Mm. So suffering shows us that there is a true gap between the finite and the infinite, and that we are not always privy to the reasons that the infinite, which we are not, does certain things. And that knowledge is not to depress us or anger. It shouldn't do that. What it should help us recognize is that our finitude is built into creation. We were not created as mini-gods, and so we're not sovereign over anything. What that finitude helps us do is help us realize that there is a gap between the finite and the infinite, and that in order for us to know why there's evil, suffering, and know the purposes behind all of that, we have to be infinite. Mm-hmm. But we're not. Mm-hmm. And that recognition is the first step to where there's a seed of the gospel, recognizing that in Christ, the infinite has crossed over to the finite and now bridges that gap. Mm-hmm. And there's more to that. It's a gap that we've complicated because of our sin. So, in short, we can't always answer the why question, but we can talk through the implications of what it means to suffer and what it means for there to be evil in the world in helpful ways.
Yeah, and maybe having that conversation with someone, if they truly want to try to get to the bottom of the truth that might be there, the fact that they are entering God into the equation, so this difficult is happening because God. As soon as you enter God into the equation, that's where the tension comes. That's where the problem comes. And I would say that in my worldview, if God was not in the equation and you saw all of these difficult things happening in the world, then that also says something that's difficult too. So I think what is the point of life? What is going on? If there's pain, there's suffering, but there is no God, am I satisfied with that? If I enter God into the equation, now I'm wondering, why would he allow that? And then maybe, and I wonder what you would think about this, maybe that's an opportunity to invite someone into what you're saying, is that you can know God personally and he can help you maybe understand things about the ways that he works and who he is. And you might not know all the answers, but inviting someone into a relationship with God can help maybe ease some of that tension, because I'm not a believer yet, but I'm how can God do this or that,
I think one of the things it's sort of a default way of thinking through things is that, particularly for those that are believers, but even especially, I would say, for those that aren't believers in God, or Jesus is the way to God, or the empowerment of God, the Holy Spirit, sort of the default way to thinking through things, is that we have, at least on most occasions, right, at least on some occasions, the right to know why things happen the way that they do. And one of the things that we learn through the book of Job, through the narrative prologue of the book of Job, is that readers, us, we're given privileged information, so we're actually given the reasons as to why the things are about to happen to Job, but none of the characters know this. Mm-hmm. And so as we read, the structure, the way the book is structured teaches, not just what the contents of the book, but the way that the book is structured, teaches us that we actually don't, I would say on most occasions or all occasions, have a sufficient amount of knowledge to adequately judge what's actually happening to us. Now, that doesn't mean it hurts any less.
Yeah.
But what it does mean is that when we go through situations, we have a book of the Bible, at least one, but others, that shows us that we are not we're not the divine sovereign. And we don't have the right to make commands on the divine sovereign to reveal to us those things which he didn't reveal to the blameless and upright Job. Now, I want to reiterate, this is not me simply saying you have no right to question God. On the contrary, what we see through the precatory Psalms and we see through Job is that, and we see Jeremiah 12, verses 1 and 2. We even see Abraham to a certain extent saying, whoa, wait a second. God, this doesn't seem to be making sense. Mm-hmm. Are you saying that you're going to kill the righteous with the wicked, or you're going to destroy the righteous with the wicked? And Job was like, damn the day I was born. Like, that's what he says. Our translations make it sound nicer. It's not nice. He's saying, like, may the day I was born be damned. Mm-hmm. And Jeremiah says, look, in chapter 12, the reference was Job 3. Jeremiah in chapter 12 says, look, you'd be right if I were to pick a fight with you. But the way of the wicked prospers. Why? What is happening here? And Job in chapter 9 also says, like, it's all one, we all die, similarly sounding similar to Ecclesiastes. It's all one, and God, the problem has to be with you because I'm holding to my integrity. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to admit that I did something to bring this along. I'm holding to my integrity, so the problem has to be with you. You're the one that destroys the righteous with the wicked. You're the one that's laughing at the impotence of the innocent, like this is all you. So we have these biblical characters being very honest with God. They weren't empirically correct all of the time, but we see real pain in the Bible because of the suffering issue. Mm-hmm. So we have to recognize that as human beings. This is not just a theological way of sort of brushing real pain under the rug. Yeah. Let's not do that. Mm-hmm. But we have to balance that with the fact that we're not mini sovereigns. Mm-hmm. And that frequently we simply do not have enough information to adequately judge our own situations, let alone judge the purposes of God. Sometimes, in certain situations, we're given enough information to be able to see what God may have been doing through certain circumstances. Yeah. Maybe I can give a brief testimony if that would be helpful for the suffering thing. So what I'm about to share now, it incorporates a couple of my family members, but I've shared in public before, and they're fine with me sharing this illustration. It's important for the record to make sure. About 17, 18 years ago or so, my mother got really sick. She started to experience numbness in her legs, and the medical doctors didn't know what was wrong with her. She started to experience numbness in her legs to the point where she couldn't walk, and she had to be hospitalized for several months at a time. So hospitalizations were more than one, and it was for more than a month at a time. And as a result of that, she lost her job. Naturally, she couldn't work. And so after she was released from the hospital for the last time, while she was at home and still not able to work, now I'll just pause here. People that go through those, like my mom's pain was real. Mm-hmm. And she was in a precarious financial situation because she no longer had children living with her, but we weren't supporting her financially. We just weren't, right? And so she still needed to work. She wasn't retired at all, didn't have those types of resources, but at the same time couldn't. So she was in a precarious situation, and her pain was real, physical pain as well as the questioning, what's going on here, Mm-hmm. Well, during that time when she was at home and she wasn't able to work, but was relearning how to walk, she started caring for children in the foster care program. And she cared over the years for 40, 50 kids in her house. Who knows how many kids, which were all hopefully blessed by that experience. And through the foster care system, she ended up adopting 3 children. So now I have 3 younger brothers. There were 4 biological children and 3 children that were also in precarious family situations, and are now living in a steady household, stable household with my mother. So I have a 15-year-old brother, 14-year-old brother, and a 7-year-old brother. From different ethnic backgrounds, we're a diverse family. I mean, it's the beauty of the gospel embodied in many ways there, where we have the adoption principle and the diversity principle. Our family, we love each other. We're all so different, different ages. Now, it's easy to say, oh, my mom just went through this because, her pain was like very, very real. But sometimes we live long enough and we're able to see it's as a result. Like if my mother would have still been working and she never got that sickness, she would have never gone through she'd never gone through the hospital program. She would never gotten into the foster care program. She would have never adopted the children that we love that are now growing up in her household. None of that would have happened.
Yeah.
So sometimes in life, we're able to live long enough to see that beautiful side of things.
Yeah.
But frequently, we ask these types of questions when we're going through the difficult time periods. And so that's all real.
Yep.
But but also a very real illustration is that sometimes we're able to see the beautiful side of things as time goes on and things, life continues.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. I think something else, as you're talking, that could be also a comfort to us is not only can we know, we're finite, like you said, we're not little gods, but we can know God who is infinite and infinitely wise and loving. And not only that, but he became a human that was God, Jesus, and we see that he also was grieved by suffering, and his friend Lazarus died, and that grieved him. So I always think too, like maybe we can help people see in helping to answer that question: why does God allow suffering? Well, God is very aware of the suffering in the world, and when he became a human, he demonstrated that it also grieves him. That could be an element of the conversation too, possibly.
There's no simple apologetic answer to this, really. The grief that we sense as a result of living in this imperfect world, in which there's systematic issue with what we as Christians call sin, rebellion again, like not because of any particular sin, but now we're dealing with a systematic issue. There's no simple response to this.
Yeah.
This is the world that we live in. And so we shouldn't provide simple responses, but we should say sometimes we're given enough information where we can transcend our suffering, and we can thank God that we're able to see some of the positives on the other end. He's seeing all of the positive in his divine sovereign plan, right? He's seeing the beauty of the history of salvation and the culmination of that with Jesus' return and and the new heavens and the new earth and all of that. All of these things that we undergo as human beings, he's seeing in light of his divine plan. It's very difficult for us to do that.
Yeah. Now, a couple of these questions that we'll hit today, maybe some are kind of general Bible or questions about God. Some of them will also related to the Old Testament, that being part of, you just said you studied Job for still ongoing, right? But that's part of what you've dedicated your life to, is specifically is studying the Old Testament, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So we'll definitely have some questions related to the Old Testament. Now, as we were discussing that first question, you mentioned something which is the imprecatory Psalms. Could you explain what those are?
Yeah, so those Psalms, there's a group of Psalms frequently called imprecatory Psalms, in which the psalmist will be open and honest about the psalmist's feelings and essentially utilize language that sounds like they are condemning, especially their enemy. And sometimes frequently in those Psalms, we get language that in our churches we might not be used to hearing or using as it relates to our enemies or God's justice. And frequently these psalmists will cry out for justice in ways, again, that are a little bit shocking to us, bringing up issues and using harsh language. So sometimes reading through these imprecatory Psalms, because of that, is difficult for Christians. It's difficult for Christians to to know what to do with them.
Right, because of some of the language there, and it's like we know that we're called to be genuine in our prayers, but how genuine is a little too genuine? I guess would be the question is like how like it's like should we be praying for the demise of our enemies? Like some people, like you're saying, might kind of struggle with that. So how do what do we learn from the imprecatory Psalms then? Is there a line when it comes to our prayer life, or should we always be just emotionally bearing all those thoughts and things before the Lord? Like, how do we interpret that?
One of the things that we learn through books like Job and Ecclesiastes, I would say, is that we as earthly beings are intended to be earthly beings. So when we have, and we're given, I would say that holistic view of what we see in certain areas, holistically, we're given enough information to transcend being simply earthly beings. But we are earthly beings that have genuine sentiments that are provoked by situations in life, like injustices, for example, and as we see in Job, what we understand to be injustice, as well as the fact that we're going to die, which is something that we see all over the book of Ecclesiastes. So we look at these types of books, and we read the words of the main characters, Job and Job's friends, but especially Job as it relates to this question, and Kohelet. And we're like, whoa, like that. And let's talk about the imprecatory Psalms as well. Like we read those words and we're like, whoa, wait a second. Like, I guess I'm not the only one that was thinking this.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So now sometimes we auto-censor ourselves and we don't even admit those types of things. So we play kind of these mind games with ourselves as even as Christian people. Like you can't do that, or you can't say that to God. And like a universal reality is that if you believe in a divine sovereign, he already knows.
And Jesus says that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So the expression part is cathartic, therapeutic, to use those types of, for us, because we frequently know that through prayer and through expressing our sentiments through words, we are able to process things in a unique way that even thinking them doesn't always help us process.
Yeah.
And so frequently throughout the Bible, Job, Ecclesiastes, the imprecatory Psalms, when you see injustices being done, or when whatever the author perceives to be injustice, one of the ways that we see the biblical characters in these books expressing that is through words. Like, I've seen a great injustice done under the sun. Everyone meets the same end. Now, this is me roughly quoting Ecclesiastes in several areas. Does that mean that God is unjust? No, that's not. Does it mean that everybody meets the final, ultimate, like post Christ's return end? No, that's not what the author's saying. The author's saying is, Kohelet in this case, is saying, hey, have you ever noticed that the king and the servant, they end up in the grave? That just doesn't seem right. So what do we do in light of all of these weird observations that we have in life? Like everything's just cyclical. We should fear God and keep his commandments. That's irrespective of us not being able to make sense of some of this stuff. We fear God and keep his commandments. That's so earthly. You wake up every morning, you yawn, you get your cup of coffee, you step out of the door, you forget your keys, you go back, you get in your car. Like every day we live these lives. We're like, it's so earthly. But we won't say that. The author of Ecclesiastes does for us.
Yeah.
It's earthly, and Job helps us recognize that we can be direct with God. Those Psalms can help us recognize, hey, we need to be open and direct and honest with God. There is no line here.
Yeah.
Whatever, it's way better to be in communication with God than it is to not be in communication with God concerning things with which you are in communication with yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know about you. I guess kind of part of what you're saying is, you walk with the Lord for a while and he helps you and he helps sanctify you and you learn things, you realize things about yourself. Somewhere along the way, I realized that in my prayer life, sometimes that I would think that I had faith because I was thinking things, right? Like, oh, God's got this, or I'm struggling in my mind, like, why is this happening? And I realized at a certain point, I wasn't actually praying those things, though. Like, I was thinking them in my mind, like, gee, I really want this thing in my life. But I didn't actually go to God and say, God, I would like this thing, and I don't know how this is going to happen, and, I need this amount of money. And I think that's like a step of faith when you actually start to, like you're saying, communicate those things to the Lord rather than just kind of running around in your head, even though he does know our hearts, right?
Think about this. So, like, I'm a professor of Bible, and I would like to think that I'm in a tradition that is historically orthodox. Mm-hmm. So theological orthodoxy is very important for me. But one thing that I think that we see through sections of the Bible in which there's characters pouring out their hearts to God, like to use that image, like literally just like giving God all they got, is that God is more concerned about our openness and honesty than he is about our theological orthodoxy. Now, they go together. Yeah, so I need to I patched it up before I started saying that, and I'll patch it up again now. But that phrase actually matters. So none of us have perfect systematic theologies. We are flawed human beings. And so we'll go to God and we'll say things that just aren't empirically true at times. Like, God, you are letting this happen for reason X, Y, and Z. I'm upset. Like, those things, they're very earthly, but sometimes they're just not true. God, okay. But when we feel those, should we expect ourselves to sort of change our feelings? And should we try to manipulate our situation? Should we try to self-talk ourselves? No, you go to him and you say things, and frequently through verbally processing these things in prayer, God will work out your theological orthodoxy. He'll let you know that's through the study of the word, through it. Like, that's not exactly what's going on here, right? And as a result of expressing genuine sentiment, genuine thoughts, genuine prayers, God does work all of the heterodox stuff that we can fabricate, especially about his character. That stuff gets worked out. But in any area in life, and this is a young adults podcast, so let's talk about like just young adult stuff. Any areas of life, whether it be, marriage, or whether it be work, or whether it be like, trajectory in life or ministry, or there are these areas where there's always taboo areas connected to this. So human sexuality and like theology of money, and all of those are related to good things like marriage and work and all of these things. But like, touch on those areas for a sec. Sometimes we can auto censor ourselves to like be like, oh, I know that this like human sexuality issue that I have, it's really a big deal. I kind of can't talk to God about this. Like, what I feel, that's bogus. Yeah. That's like straight up first steps of what people have been calling deconstruction. That's not the God that we serve. We serve a God that looked at Job's situation and let Job talk for all those chapters before showing up and not exactly revealing the reason, but saying to Job, I'm going to actually play on this finitude spectrum. All right. And this is how we're going to work through this. Same God. Ecclesiastes says, it's all the same. It's all heaven. It's all ephemeral. Everybody's going to die, And then eventually there's enough wisdom in the book where we read, you know what? Despite our very earthly observations, they are incomplete. Obviously, you need to honor God. You need to follow God. You need to follow God's word. That's the God that we read in the Bible. A God that can take a pushback. His feelings aren't hurt when we push back in all integrity, like Job did.
Yep. Yeah, I think another cool Old Testament example of this would be, and correct me if I'm wrong, is
You're wrong.
Darn it. The prophet Habakkuk. That book is essentially this interaction between him and God. It's a prayer, essentially, right? And it makes one of the things that makes that book unique. Right. And you see, he is struggling with real things. He's looking at things happening in the world around him, and he's like, how is this? Like, how do these things go together with who God is? Why would you allow this? And by the end of this interaction and this communication with God, you see he arrives at some level of peace. Maybe he hasn't gotten all the answers to his questions, but he's just expressing these concerns to God.
Absolutely. So to go back to your question, I just think that we shouldn't draw artificial lines in the sand. We need to be, especially in our formative years, open and honest and direct with God about exactly that which is going on in our minds and hearts, as much as we can be open and honest and direct with ourselves.
Yep. And that's part of also the importance of church community, right?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
going to God with these things and going to brothers and sisters in Christ with these things on our hearts too.
Yeah.
You mentioned a word in our discussion in this last question, which was the idea of injustice.
Sure.
And some people look at God and the Bible and they struggle because they look at the Old Testament God and the New Testament, and Jesus in the New Testament, and it's almost like there's two different gods, and they'll say things like in the Old Testament, God allows slavery, or he allows polygamy, or he directly instructs his people to kill women and children in certain instances. So, recently I heard someone kind of expressing a struggle with how could God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son? I mean, isn't this child sacrifice? So how do we answer the question of like, how is this the same God? It almost seems like two different gods, Old Testament versus New Testament. Yeah,
there are a couple of resources that I can think of at this point. So one of the resources is written by a colleague of mine named Charlie Trim, and it's essentially questioning why God would allow war and violence in the Old Testament, and covers some of the specific things that you just mentioned. There are other resources like "Is God a Moral Monster?" which is essentially the question you're asking, by Paul Copan, who's written books. So there are these books that treat these issues in more profound ways than I can talk about during our time. And it's important also to say that when we talk about these issues, the specific issues need to be handled exegetically. Now, here's what I mean by exegetically. We need to be able to look at the passages that talk, for example, about some of the issues that you just mentioned, slavery, or one of the things that here's something I like to bring up as part of this, and that is what we know as levirate marriage. So that's another one where you're like, whoa, like what's this? So levirate marriage is essentially the brother marrying a dead brother's wife to produce offspring with the woman that was the wife of the dead brother. It's like, whoa, is that honoring to the woman? All of these issues need to be treated exegetically. So we don't just provide one pat answer for all of them.
Right.
All of these texts are written within contexts, first and foremost, literary contexts. They're all literature. So we need to look at what's going on in the context of those writings in order to be able to see what's what these texts might be saying in their literary context. In addition to that, there are also very important historical contexts that can't be ignored. So I mentioned levirate marriage, weird text. Levirate marriage was something that was practiced in different forms in different societies in the ancient Near East. So being that God always spoke in the language of the people, and that the people pre-Torah may have been defaulting to the ways in which others acted in the ancient Near East, God would have regulated certain activities that the people were doing in order for these activities to reflect his justice in his society. And there's all different ways to think through specific issues that we just mentioned. But what you really were getting to is how do we reconcile the God of the old with the God of the new? This is not, again, a new question. This is something that people have been thinking through for many, many years, probably since the writing of the New Testament, right? So I would like to start off just saying that I'm going to direct this answer more toward contemporary readers in this sense. Contemporary Christian readers that go to evangelical-ish churches, here comes a statement that might anger some of the listeners.
We like those kinds of statements on this podcast. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Cool. But here's you might get some fire. And that is, those types of contemporary Christians in evangelical-ish churches tend to be, you ready for this? Almost exclusively New Testament Christians. Now, some people might be like, well, what are we supposed to be? Right. It's a new covenant.
Yeah.
Right? It's a new covenant. And I kind of think to myself, all right, let's take a step back. Our churches tend to teach implicitly, it doesn't need to be explicitly within the context of the congregation, but implicitly we teach what theologians and biblicists would call the verbal plenary inspiration of the Scripture. Verbal refers to words. It doesn't mean audible. It means verbal, so it refers to words. Plenary means all of it, so in its entirety. Inspiration we read means something like God breathed. So God breathed this word out. The human words should be identified with the word of God, verbal plenary inspiration. So we're like, okay, got it. Yeah, my church would say all of the Bible is inspired by God. All of the words of God are inspired by God. They would say something like that. And then I'm kind of like, aha, got you where I want you. Now I'm going to eat you. Because if that's the case, then why do the red letters of Jesus get more attention than Leviticus? Mm-hmm. Why do Paul's letters get more attention than the genealogies and chronicles? Why is that? Mm-hmm. And the reality is that we have a canon within a canon.
Yeah.
That's in terms of practical ministry, we tend to emphasize certain types of teachings. And in our types of churches, I say our types of churches as in broadly evangelical, broadly speaking North American, church, what we do is we emphasize a couple of books from the Old Testament, but it's lots of red letters and Paul's letters.
Yeah.
All right, so in my circle, which is sort of the neo-reformed soteriology circle, right? It's like, we believe the whole Bible's inspired, but Romans and Galatians, like, yes.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that's where salvation is really spoken about.
Yeah.
Now, the reason why I say that, and being self-critical here, trying to even, I'm criticizing my own crews here, you know? It's a real thing. When we do these types of things, we don't generally take into consideration aspects of God that are clearly portrayed in other sections of the Scriptures. So we end up having a very, I guess you could say, closed or smaller view of the character of God if we focus exclusively on certain books of the Bible. Now, if we're New Testament, almost exclusively New Testament Christians, though we give lip service to the rest of the Bible, but we're almost exclusively New Testament Christians, we're going to think that the depiction of Jesus in the New Testament is the holistic depiction of God. Now, I understand why people might push back and be like, but Colossians 2:9 says, in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. And Hebrews 1:3 says, when we see Jesus, we see the exact imprint of God. And I believe that.
Yeah.
But what we do have are lots of other scriptures that feed into what that means. Mm-hmm. And we don't have lots and lots of other scriptures that talk about how Jesus manifested that. What we have are the Gospels. Mm-hmm. So if we go back and we think about some of the things that you mentioned that could be perceived as injustices and some of the seriously difficult sections of the Bible that we see mostly in the Old Testament, we have to read those in light of the fact that these are essentially pieces of the pie that give us a holistic view of who God is. So by the time we get to Jesus, we shouldn't be surprised by Jesus talking about loving people and caring for the vulnerable, caring for those that would be, quote unquote, the worst of all sinners in his society, those people that were marginalized and oppressed, those people that were powerless. We should not at all think that this is new, because that's exactly how God told the people of Israel to treat those that were marginalized and oppressed in their society. Yeah. You permit people to come from the outside, those people are going to be vulnerable. You give them the same rights that people would have here, right? And that could be nuanced. The widow, don't even think about moving her boundary stone, because I'll look out for the widow and the orphan. The sojourner, the widow, the orphan, those people are really cared for by God in the Old Testament. Yeah. We have the New Testament. That shouldn't be a surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise to see Jesus doing these types of things. All right. So what about the wrath of God then? And this is normally where this question circulates. There's God in the Old Testament speaking specifically to the people of Israel on many occasions, and not only carrying out his wrath through Israel upon others, but also his wrath enacted upon Israel. We frequently jump around that part, actually. Jesus makes more explicit in the New Testament, like by leaps and bounds more explicit, this whole concept of eternal separation from God. Yeah. In a place where there's eternal conscious torment. By the way, I'm using systematic words.
We'd call that hell.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So but you got to understand the way that I'm explaining it. I'm saying it in such a way that I recognize that this is, I'm sort of importing systematic theology into the conversation. What I'm saying is, we get these arguments from Jesus, not exclusively, but mostly from what Jesus says. Yeah. So reading these types of things that happen in the Old Testament, by the time we get to Jesus, it shouldn't really surprise us either that Jesus talks about eternal conscious torment. So the idea that we have a new God show up in the New Testament as is manifested through Jesus, I tend to think at least begins with a problematic reading of the wholeness of Scripture.
Yeah.
We as human beings, we do this.
Right.
That's why we read in community. But we should recognize it's difficult for us to fully emphasize the holistic picture, the character of God throughout the Scriptures. And that should be an understanding that goes into our reading before making these, what I would consider to be hyperbolic claims that we just have two different gods.
Yeah, it's not as if Jesus never said difficult things or things that would be perceived as separating people, or he said things like, I came to bring a sword, and if you have to, paraphrasing, like you have to love me more than your mother or your father, and those kinds of, right? Yeah, like those things are not like, oh, gracious, kind Jesus. Like, I want to live my life by everything he says. So, yeah, I do wonder if sometimes that is an evidence of people sometimes like to pick and choose like certain verses or ideas, and this is the part I want to follow, and then this is the part that I'm not sure about, or this is the part I kind of want to hate on. And to go back to kind of what you said earlier, too, the cultural context is important, right? Like when we talk about something like slavery. Now, when we talk about slavery in the Old Testament, I'm not saying that it was good, but I'm saying is it's very different there in the Old Testament in ancient times than how we perceive it now in our culture, correct? Like we view those things very differently.
Yeah. Now, a couple of things with the slavery issue. When we say slavery in North America, like
mind goes
United
somewhere.
States, yes.
Yeah.
We have what we almost always think about is shadow slavery.
Right.
So, and it's really important for us to recognize that that's where our mind goes when we think about that. Now, by the way, you also said, not that it was good, and by the way, I think that was a very good thing, by the way. Not that any type of what we would call slavery would be good.
Right.
But we do not see what we like the type of shadow slavery that North America, I would say, unfortunately had a history of, and that we're still dealing in a very real way with the consequences of to this very day in terms of like these systemic injustices that are built into society as a result of people's color, people's ethnicity. Yeah, those are like very real things. It doesn't seem, and again, we need to treat these dimensions of slavery exegetically, because there are different ways in which the Bible mentions slavery and or what we would call having slaves or something like that in different ways. So we need to treat these issues exegetically. But overall, it's not the shadow slavery that we saw. It wasn't like leaving Spain, picking up Africans and North Africans, not considering them as human beings, taking them to, for example, my family's from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, what eventually became Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic, treating them there as impersonal human beings. That's more like where our mind goes when we say slavery.
Yeah.
Though I must admit that this is a complicated issue, and the question, one of the issues that needs to be treated is how humane were, as much as we can get from the biblical text, how humanely were these people treated based upon our contemporary standards, but also the standards of their day. But it does seem, and there's no real simple answer to some of this, but it does seem also that we have an element of what we would call slavery in the Bible that is willful.
Right.
So someone working for someone as a result of their will.
It was actually potentially a better form of life than they might live alternatively to that.
These are some of the questions.
Right.
And then, so transcending willful, like working off a particular amount of years, then you have a scenario in which we have people saying, no, I want to stay with you like for good. Willingly. All right. Now, that still needs to be looked into because of, were these people vulnerable? Could they have been taken advantage of by people that had resources and therefore had power? Like, all of that needs to be looked into legitimately. But one of the things that we definitely should rethink is reading slavery in the Bible, or reading something about slaves, particularly the Old Testament, and then saying shadow slavery.
Yeah.
Same as what what 17th and 18th, more like 18th and 19th century America did. Same thing Therefore, again, God is a moral monster
Right.
because of this. And it's not a one for one.
It's a little more complicated.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need to think through things carefully.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. Before leaving our faith because of this.
For
you know what I
sure.
mean? That's kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, absolutely. What about the whole polygamy thing? Does it seem like God is like sort of allowing this amongst his people in the Old Testament? You just briefly mentioned that earlier, but what's the deal with that?
Well, is God allowing this? And the
Right.
answer has to be absolutely yes.
Yeah.
Because that's what we see in the narrative.
Mhm.
The question is, how do the narratives in which we read about polygamy portray polygamy?
Mm-hmm.
Because the narrator tends to be the plenipotentiary for God. So the narrator's like, yo, let me tell you how these stories play out.
Right.
Okay? Now, by the way, I'll just pause and say, not that I need to, but I will say, I condemn all forms of polygamy. You get this, right?
Let's just be clear.
Yeah, let's be clear here. And would you speak on behalf of the church to say you condemn that here?
I would agree with that statement.
And we have to admit,
Yeah.
forms of polygamy, they're degrading.
Mhm.
They always have been.
Mhm.
If we believe that God's plan for the family started in the portrayal of Eden, polygamy was never part of the plan, and therefore was
Right.
always a corruption of God's plan.
Yep.
And what I would say is that it's bothersome for people like us to read sections of the Bible in which polygamy is practiced by well-known figures and not hear the narrators say what we just said.
Mhm.
Polygamy is bad. We condemn it. And so that leads to an understanding by some people that polygamy was thought of as like something that was okay or
Yeah.
something like that.
Right.
Never okay. Always abusive. Like, okay, all right. So how would we be like, nah, polygamy is not cool now, even though it's never explicitly stated that it's not cool in the Bible. And here is where I think we get to one of the fundamental issues that relate to how we read Old Testament narratives. And I got some of this mostly from my Israeli teachers. So not all of the thoughts that I'm going to share are completely original, but frequently Old Testament author. Oh, and by the way, if you want the citations, I write about this extensively in my book, Engaging the Old Testament. Minor plug, but here you go. Biblical narrators, they are characters in the story as well. We don't think of them as characters in the story, but they are characters. And they do certain things in certain ways that help readers understand what's important. Now, if you go through and you follow the narratives, first of all, accept that. What I just said, you got to accept that. It's not like the biblical writers were just writing like bullet points. Right. They're like telling stories, and they're telling stories in such a way that and they're not comprehensive, they're selective. So they're telling stories in such a way that you and I should be able to, or not just you and I, but especially original readers. They're looking at these stories and they're like, oh, that's important to the writer, right? Okay. Why are you giving me all this information? Why are you withholding information from me? Why did you tell that story out of order? All of these things are they're rhetorical tactics that the writers of the Bible used in order to emphasize what they consider to be important.
Right. Yeah.
Now, as we start to read through these narratives where there's polygamy, I just think like, all right, Abraham wasn't exactly what we might understand to be a polygamist, but did things end up going well with him when he followed Sarah's advice and the story is told in such a way where we're like, ooh, that seemed to cause some tension, right?
Yeah.
So the narrator just doesn't jump out and tell you, don't do this. But in other words, he's saying, don't do this.
Letting you see the results.
He lets you see it. Exactly.
Yeah.
They don't tell you what to do. They show you what to do. They're different, right?
Mm-hmm.
They let you burn your hand on the surface of the hot stove so that you know,
It's
oh,
one way to
right?
learn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So then we jump to, let's just go to one of the most obvious ones, Jacob, Israel. So he's got 2 wives. That all starts off as an issue, right? Then he's got 2 concubines, which is inherently abusive. Oh, just take my handmaid. Like, you go have relations with her. Like, that's completely cool. She's my property. So, it's like, whoa, jacked up. How did that whole polygamous situation end up, right? Okay, let's jump to another one that we frequently don't think of as straight polygamy, but it is. Elkanah and Hannah. All right, so it's like, look at how, let's like read between the lines of those first couple of chapters.
This is 1 Samuel chapter 1.
Yes,
Yep.
yes, yes, yes. So here's Elkanah. He evidently is portrayed as being not only really loving toward Hannah, at least in his best way possible, but he also is depicted as going to Shiloh to make like the yearly sacrifices and stuff. It's like probably a pretty good dude, and I think that's how the narrator's portraying him. But he has a wife that can't have children. So then he has another wife. So it's reasonable to suggest that the narrator is portraying to us a scenario in which Hannah can't have children. And therefore, her husband takes another woman who has lots of children. And then how'd that scenario play out? Peninnah is like making fun of Hannah or whatever, however we want to read it, right?
Yep.
Putting it in young adults' terms.
Yeah.
How did these situations turn out? So how is polygamy actually depicted to us in the Bible? It's not stated, there is no chapter on polygamy, in the book of what to do within the context of marriage. We don't have that book, and we don't have that chapter that tells us exactly what what the narrator's trying to communicate through these narratives. But we do have the narratives, and if we understand those narratives, considering the fact that narrators did what narrators have always done, which is tell the story in a specific way to get across the main points, we begin to perceive that polygamy is not something that God's like totally fine with. Like, oh yeah, David, go marry a bunch of women. That's going to be totally fine, except for the fact that his downfall ends up being his abuse of a woman. Yeah. Like a major downfall. Hey, Solomon, it's totally cool that while you're growing in wisdom, you pick up all of these extra quote unquote wives and concubines or whatever. Totally cool, except for the fact that Solomon eventually builds his wives' altars right in front of the temple in Jerusalem. Like, how'd that one play out for you? So how could we say that we have, the God of the Bible is totally fine with polygamy, when in fact, all of these scenarios show up that he's not totally fine with how polygamy plays out?
So one could probably argue, based on what you're saying, that it's maybe a more effective way to communicate polygamy is bad, to show us some of these examples of the drama and the hurt and the pain that ensued from some of those relationships, rather than God just saying, thou shalt not be a polygamist.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I could say better, but I can say this is how it plays out.
Yeah.
And this is how stories play out, right? So infrequently in the Bible and in any narrative, in fact, it's a weird story if the narrator starts to say to the reader, you should be understanding this way. That's not normally what happens. I guess it could. That would be an interesting literary technique, in contemporary reading or novels or whatever. Like if the narrator says to you, hey, reader, this is what you're supposed to understand from the story. But that hardly ever happens. In fact, I read lots, and that maybe never happens. Or never say never. In the Bible, that doesn't happen very frequently. It happens occasionally, but in the Bible, it hardly ever happens. What we normally get are writing styles and techniques that we should expect because we read novels, and the Bible's not fiction, but you get the point. We read novels, but we just don't read some of the biblical narratives as well as we read other narratives. So just an example here, one brief example. We read in 1 Kings 3, 1 Kings 1 and 2, Solomon's set up as king. Adonijah wants to be king, doesn't happen. Bathsheba intercedes, Solomon becomes king. And we're as readers, yeah, okay, Solomon should be the king. He's, all right, so and the narrator seems to make it seem that way. All right, we get to chapter 3, and God appears to Solomon in a dream, right? And Solomon, we know this story. We read it in our children's Bible. Solomon asks for wisdom to rule over the people instead of asking for riches and all of other things, right? And God gives him that and says he's going to give him all the other things, essentially, that he didn't ask for. That's the children's Bible version. What the children's Bible version also doesn't tell you is that throughout the next 7 chapters, we read of Solomon doing great things, and then little bit of verses, 1, 2 verses. Oh, he married the princess from Egypt. Ding, 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 ding. Don't go back to Egypt. Don't do that, right? Yeah. He picked up, he marries this person. He does this, right? And all of a sudden, we get to Solomon, or we get to 1 Kings chapter 10, and it is shocking for us as readers to be like, whoa, what happened here? He just dedicated the temple a couple chapters ago, right? What's going on here? But the narrator, if we're reading like we should read narrative, there's straight up foreshadowing here. Solomon married this woman from Egypt. he actually sent people to Egypt to get horses, and he's not supposed to be multiplying horses, and he's definitely not supposed to go back to Egypt. This is specifically what he's told not to do. But he did. And then, hold up a sec, he made gold as prevalent in Jerusalem as ever, to the point where silver was like worth nothing. Oh, he was like told not to multiply his riches. He wasn't supposed to do that, but he did that. Mm-hmm. All of this is foreshadowing till we get to the point where like, oh, yeah, Solomon wasn't. This is all what we're supposed to understand, and this is going to end up here, and that's what it does. Mm-hmm. All right, so I think we get the same thing with polygamy.
Yeah,
lots of these stories have this sort of foreshadowing component where we get to the point where we see many of these men, powerful men like Solomon and David and Abraham with resources, getting to the point where they're like, oh, we're like as readers, oh, that this ended up in a bad spot, and the multiple wives thing has something to do with this.
Yeah. And I think you brought up earlier just the inspiration of Scripture. If you believe the Old and the New, you take all the entirety of Scripture on this type of topic. You go to the New Testament also, you kind of realize that Jesus and, God as a whole, when you go Old and New, is not really a fan of this type of arrangement, right?
Not really a fan of this type of arrangement.
To say it,
understatement, but
yes.
Yeah. But, I think if I could just harp on this just for 1 sec, it's important for people that are in our contemporary churches, in our environments. Again, we have specific environmental factors here. We live in the United States and we're English speakers, all of these things. It's important for people like us to say like, no, that's not cool, and that was never cool.
Yeah.
And let's not try to justify the biblical characters simply saying, oh, but people had a lot of wives back then. Like, no, David was abusive. Like, that's right. We shouldn't do that. And we shouldn't just justify these texts, but we also should say, maybe we're reading these in a way that doesn't permit what we know to be true. That is, the fact that this is not cool. We're probably not reading in such a way that lets that truth emerge. Our problem sometimes with reading is that we want to read who we believe these characters to be into the text. Right. We want to protect them, and we have to admit these things because there's a generation of people that are looking at us wondering if we're going to be reasonable. Like, are you trying to protect David and say it was totally cool what happened with Bathsheba? Like, are you serious, bro? Are you really going to sit there and say that that's perfectly fine because my children can read that? And we don't want to we want to be completely honest. It's not cool what these guys did at all. Yeah. And they completely abused their power. And this is not me just being a crazy professor. This is me just wanting to be honest and working through a Bible difficulty in a way that recognizes the problems behind what the characters did, but also the problems behind the contemporary perceptions of what they did.
Yeah, and the Holy Spirit wants us to be honest, and it's right, and it's the reason why God's people in the Old Testament and the apostles and many of his followers in the New Testament are depicted in a very human way, and we see their flaws. So we should be honest about those things. Yeah. Before we move on to kind of a different topic, also, just as we're talking about, kind of Old Testament difficulties, there's a long list we could go through. Maybe that would be another podcast.
Hey, let's do it.
But to the question of how could God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son? I mean, this is just like a level of inhumane, type of activity, like, for someone who just can't wrap their mind around, how could God ask someone to do that? This is essentially child sacrifice. How do we begin, like earlier, to answer that type of question?
This is not an easy question, and that's not Fuller. That's me. Filler. That's not filler.
Yeah.
That's me admitting what I just said we should admit. This is not an easy one.
Yeah.
All right. So, if you're a parent and you have children and you're thinking through the worst things for parents to think through at times are their children suffering, let alone actually being called to kill one of your children. That's it's not just filler. That's a real theological practical parenting type of thing. And so I get the question. I also think that if we look through the rest of other areas of the scriptures, people that are prophetic voices, especially in the history of Israel, are asked to do really weird things.
Yeah.
Like lay on your side for a really long time, or, I did this and then my wife died. Boom, like all of a sudden we see, or roaming around the streets for a really long time. Now, they don't have the same type of, like emotional baggage that Sacrifice Your Child has, but we do see really weird things happening for divine purposes elsewhere in the Old Testament. So it shouldn't be shocking for us to see that there would be something that would be sort of this crazy. Okay. And I think it's important to understand that. But it's also important for us to understand that these crazy events and calls made it into a written text, the Scripture. And as the written text is told, it's told in such a way that provides foreshadowing for very important future fulfillments. Now, I don't mean prophetic fulfillments, and this is not straight futuristic prophecy. But what God does frequently throughout the Old Testament narrative is paints pictures without explicitly stating what's being painted. Paints pictures for things to come that we don't understand until it's explained, all right? So I think like of the parable of the sower, and this is just an example, it's an illustration, but in the parable of the sower, it's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And in the Gospels, Jesus talks about the parable, he talks about spreading seed, and then his disciples are like, what did that mean, brah? You know what I mean? Like, and he's like, okay, let me tell you what it meant.
Yeah.
And he tells his disciples what it meant. Now, what we get sometimes is just like the first half of the parable in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And we read, wait, God told him to go sacrifice him, and then like he just pulled a switcheroo on him at the end. That's a weird story. Yes. Okay, fine.
It is.
And this has been talked about lots. It's not an easy story just within the context of Genesis.
Yeah.
But if we understand the story to be communicating literarily a principle that we ultimately see expanded and fulfilled, not in the futuristic sense, but fulfilled in that there's an ultimate kind of culmination of this image, and that is man, son, sacrifice, replacement of the sacrifice or substitution of the sacrifice. If we understand the principles that are being communicated here, then in the history of salvation to be key principles that God eventually uses to redeem humankind, I think we can view the narrative as fitting into what we eventually see happening through the person and the work of Jesus.
Yeah.
But not only that, to recognize that even in the Old Testament, the context of the Old Testament, people are asked to do weird things precisely for these types of points.
Yeah.
That it factors later into what might be the history of the people, or what might be, let's say, redemptive motifs that are culminated in Christ, or culminated in the message of the New Testament.
Yeah. Do you think that it could also be both and, where there is this foreshadowing of the gospel, and also, and maybe this is more speculation on my part.
Stop.
Let's just,
all right, fine. Let's
just
this
go
better
for
be good.
it. I'm just going for it. Could it also be just for, maybe there was a lesson for Abraham and this son, Isaac, that he had? Could there have been maybe some temptation toward like idolizing his son, becoming like an idol in his life? Was this maybe a way also for God to help Abraham not have some type of unhealthy relationship toward his son? Could that be possible?
Yeah.
I don't know. My brain just thinks,
Yeah, your brain should be thinking. That's healthy. So a couple of things that we do in how we read, we have to admit how we read. When we come to texts like this, we want to stick to what's explicitly stated and sometimes what's not stated. So I watch these detective shows, and sometimes these detective shows, when they're interviewing people, they're saying, we just want people to talk, because sometimes they can say things and tell the truth, which is always great. Sometimes they say things and they lie, which is always good because we kind of know the truth. But sometimes they don't say certain things, and whatever they end up saying, as long as they keep talking, like we can sort of kind of derive the truth from that, right? I don't think that the Bible's lying to us, but what I am saying is sometimes as we follow the narrative, we can see, okay, like these are sort of explicit facts, and these things are not being said. So we tend to derive our interpretations inductively by what's being said and what's not being said, which could be said, right? And no, really, like we're not getting, like it's explicitly stated, Mount Moriah. It's explicit, like there's these things that are explicitly stated.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, sometimes in our those things that which are not said, which sometimes factor into our interpretation, we want to do our best to not make so much. We don't want to make such a big deal out of these arguments or interpretations that aren't explicitly stated.
Right.
What we want to do is we want to factor into our whole sort of equation. There are things that could be stated that aren't explicitly stated, and maybe bring those points up in our preaching and teaching as points of application.
Right.
So the text never explicitly states that Abraham, was
developing some unhealthy attachment
exactly.
to his...
It never does.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Given the context of Abraham's situation with Hagar, and then his son Ishmael, and then the birth of his son in their old age, could we, within the context of our congregation or Bible study, draw some of the potential principle out and say, like, hey, what we see here is the desire to have a child, and finally the child comes. Maybe in our lives there's a desire for something, and finally we have that, and then we want to make sure that we are willing to give it to God.
Right.
Okay. Is the text teaching that? That's the question.
Yeah.
And it's not explicitly teaching that.
Yeah.
So hopefully what I just said
Yep.
helps us discern between how to interpret and how to apply.
Mm-hmm.
In an interpretation, I would not overemphasize some things that the text doesn't explicitly say.
Yeah.
But in our application, I think we can, in non-dogmatic ways, bring some of those principles out and say, church, this text might be able to apply to us in this way as well.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Could we also say that God knew that although he asked Abraham to do something that seemed very weird, like God knew it wasn't actually going to happen? Does that give us any consolation? I mean, not that, we're asking the question, right? So if someone is posing this question to you, does that add anything to the answer, or do you think no?
Well, from a practical theology perspective, it's hardly comforting for people to hear God is calling you to do something that doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. That is...
Well, it mattered for Abraham to go through with it, but God knew he wasn't actually going to plunge the knife into his son.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is, when we're standing before people and they're asking about this type of question, and when I say people, I'm not talking about people outside of myself. Like, I'm talking about myself too. When you think through some of these, what we would consider to be hard calls in life, like something that just doesn't make sense, it's hardly comforting for people, myself, others, to think, oh, God knew you were going to fail at that anyway, so you gave it a shot, but then you didn't. That type of like talk is not that comforting. I was being a little bit tongue in cheek when I responded initially. Yeah. But the point is, like, that's not normally the most helpful way to go in terms of practical theology. Yeah. To say that God overall knew that he wasn't going to sacrifice him. That's why he called him to do it. Right. The call for Abraham to sacrifice his son is a very real call to Abraham, as you were just saying. Just like any call in our particular life, or any difficult decision to make in our lives is very real. What we end up seeing more explicitly stated throughout the text is, it's not that God changed his mind, per se. Right. But it's that God had in mind that God was going to show not only Abraham, but all those that would participate in Abraham's story through the history of salvation, as it has been written down. That there's an image, there's an illustration here. And there's points of application, I guess, to use Christian terminology. Right. There's points of application of this story that far transcend even this one moment.